So, yeah, again, the story and a topic we've been talking sadly more and more about lately. Loneliness to the point where some suggest it's almost becoming an epidemic. And of course, much of this brought on by the pandemic. So, look, studies show that 1 in 4 Canadians feel lonely. But more importantly, other research shows loneliness actually has health consequences. In fact, they're saying effects similar to smoking cigarettes. So I guess the first question is, how is the problem so much worse? Number one, when we are more, quote, connected than ever before.
Meaning connected
right?
through
Social
our devices.
media.
Yep. Yeah.
Juliana Kaplan says a big part of the problem is the disappearance of what we refer to as fringe friends. So let's start by defining that. Juliana Kaplan is a senior labor and equality reporter for Business Insider. So, Juliana, what do we mean by the term fringe friends?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I think a fringe friend is somebody who maybe you see at a party every once in a while. They're sort of maybe on the outskirts of the people that you know, or there's someone you see at the bar sometimes or at the coffee shop. If you're a commuter, if you're commuting on public transit, maybe you're always taking the same train or bus, whatever you're taking, and you say hi to each other. These are people who aren't, your best of friends or in your close friend circle, but people who you see in sort of these more tangential situations.
And then I suppose the follow-up question is, why are these, as you're saying that, I'm going through my own mental list of the people, like the girls at the pharmacy at the Jean Coutu that I see on a couple times a week. And like you do forge these relationships and they do end up meaning more to you than you would ever think. So I guess I'm going to ask you to explain why fringe friendships are so important, even though I kind of was feeling it as you were describing what they are.
Yeah, so studies show and research shows that sometimes we can engage in what's called homophilia, where we basically associate with people who are like ourselves. And, that makes sense. You're friends with people who you have things in common with. And those are the people who maybe make up your closer circles. But fringe friends are the people who add a really important sort of variety and diversity to your life, and that they might think of somebody in your workplace who's a lot older than you and comes from a completely different area. Like, you see each other at happy hours, right? Like, that's an experience that's completely different from yours, but that also adds value and meaning to your life. And so that's what a fringe friend can be. They can also be somebody who knows someone that you might get along with well, and that's your spouse. Or maybe they know somebody who's hiring for a new job, or they're part of your community.
I'm also curious, though. Yeah. Okay, so we describe what that is, and maybe people listening are going, oh, yeah, I used to say hi, I used to whatever. Are we making sort of the assumption here that this was brought on by virtue of the fact that the pandemic meant we weren't going out, we weren't seeing people, and that's 3 years ago. So is that still the case now?
Yeah, so this is something that started prior to the pandemic, that we saw a lot of what's called third spaces or third places, which is a place that isn't your house or your work, but is sort of a free, pressure-free space to congregate. Those were already shrinking a lot. The idea of the town square or the village, right? And the pandemic accelerated a lot of that. So yeah, to your point, well, lockdowns might be done. Like, think about the person who you used to commute with. Maybe they moved to the middle of nowhere, to a cottage in the woods during the pandemic, and you're just not going to ever see them again, right? Or think about during the pandemic itself, the way that we had to really carefully choose who we saw and who we spent time with. There was no way to keep those fringe friend bonds alive, because if you were seeing people in person, maybe you were only seeing 1 or 2 people. And then if you were doing Zoom hangouts, maybe 5 or 6, right?
Juliana, I'm wondering too then about generationally, does age play a role in any of this? Are these kinds of relationships important to us at different, eras in our lives?
Yeah, so this has been a particularly big problem for younger people, especially Gen Zers, because when you're around that age, that should be the time that you're sort of fostering this larger friend networks that, we look at the numbers, and I was looking at some data from Pew Research Center, which shows that younger people increasingly have just fewer friends and fewer close friends, whereas people who are 65 and older actually have these pretty robust friend networks. And to a certain degree, that makes sense, right? Because you've had your whole life to cultivate these friendships, but those friendships are built on the foundation of this fringe friend and this fringe friend network, right? And so obviously for older people, loneliness is a big problem, but especially for younger people right now who aren't even getting a chance to build that foundational social network, it's a really big problem.
You know, it's funny because I mentioned the whole social media part right at the beginning. We've talked nothing about that in trying to describe what this is all about, but I'm going to guess that's obviously a huge part of this, right? The fact that so many people, I don't want to use the word are addicted to, but are addicted to social media and don't feel the need to get out there and have any friends, fringe or otherwise, right?
Yeah, I think it's actually even more interesting to think about it in the way that social media has changed, right? And I think that this is a big pandemic thing as well. Like, it used to be that social media was sort of a complement, like a complementary force to our lives. I think about Facebook events as a really good example of this, right? Where it used to be you could invite like 200 people who you all all were connected on this big social platform. And then when social media basically supplanted in-person social interactions during the pandemic, it became more like real life. It became more insular, right? Where we see the rise of group chats and private messages, and people aren't actually being social on social media. So it's not social media itself necessarily, but how social media has changed in response to all of this. It used to be, you would post on Facebook or Instagram and be like, oh, does anyone want to come to this reading? And 10 people would reply. Even maybe now you post that on your close friends story. That's already a smaller group.
So true.
Yeah, crazy. Isn't that how we've sort of come that way? You kind of wonder if we can ever, it's the old story, can you ever put that genie back in the bottle? I guess we'll have to wait and find out. Want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Juliana.
Fascinating.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. If you want to read up on this, it's in a magazine article, whatever, called Business Insider. If you want to find it there, all about Fringe Friends. There's a lot more to it.
I'll say.